Hey, Spooky Squad. Welcome back, or welcome in, to SpookyTales, your late-night escape into the eerie unknown. Tonight's story isn't just any tale. It's about a hotel room that doesn't just scare people, it erases them. Room 616. Every guest who stays there hears whispers through the walls, and none have ever checked out alive. What makes this story terrifying is that the last person to enter wasn't a thrill seeker or even a tourist. It was a radio host recording a live broadcast for his audience. He believed in facts, not folklore. But facts were the first thing to dissolve when he stepped inside room 616. And by the time the static faded, so had he. So grab your blanket, dim the lights, and let's unravel the last broadcast from room 616. The hotel itself stood like a scar on the landscape. Once a glamorous retreat in the 1940s, its neon sign flickered weakly now, each buzzing letter announcing its decay. Mold crept up its stone pillars, and broken windows gaped like missing teeth. Guests rarely came anymore. Locals whispered about screams heard in the night, and a strange odor of burnt radio wires drifting through the halls. The owner had stopped renting out most of the rooms, yet room 616 remained untouched, as if frozen in time. Nobody dared clean it. Nobody dared stay in it, except for Daniel Mercer, the late-night radio host known for his segment voices after midnight. He prided himself on debunking haunted legends, exposing lies with the comfort of his microphone and the calm of his voice. His listeners trusted him to peel away the supernatural and reveal the truth. But tonight, the truth was waiting to peel him away instead. Daniel arrived just before midnight, a heavy case slung over his shoulder containing his portable recording equipment. He spoke into his recorder as he walked through the warped front doors. This is Daniel Mercer, live from the infamous Crescent Hill Hotel, where guests claim room 616 eats them alive. I'm here to spend one night inside and bring you the truth. His voice echoed unnaturally, as if the building itself was repeating his words back in a whisper too low for anyone but the shadows to hear. He shook it off, setting his gear on the dusty reception desk. The keys were laid out in a cracked wooden drawer, but only one remained, brass, tarnished, with the number 616 etched so faintly it looked like it had been scratched in haste. He pocketed it, joking to his audience that the staff must really want him to stay in the haunted suite, but no step had been seen in years. The climb to the 6th floor was like moving deeper into a tomb. Each step creaked under Daniel's weight, releasing stale puffs of dust that seemed to carry whispers with them. Just the wind, he muttered into his mic, though his voice trembled slightly. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, the wallpaper rotting in streaks that resembled claw marks. As he reached the door, he froze. It wasn't the number that unsettled him. It was the faint sound of static, like an untuned radio, bleeding from inside the room. He set down his gear, adjusted his microphone, and chuckled nervously. Well, listeners, seems room 616 is already trying to set the mood. The key turned stiffly, as if the lock itself didn't want him inside. When the door swung open, the static surged, spilling into the hallway like a living presence. The room smelled of damp carpet and something metallic, coppery, like old blood. Dust sheets draped over cracked furniture, but the center of the room was bare, save for an antique radio sitting on the nightstand. Its dial flickered faintly, though no power ran through the building. Daniel set up his equipment, arranging his microphone and recorder on the warped desk, and sat on the bed. "All right, my friends," he said, voice steady though his pulse hammered in his ears. "Welcome to room 616. They say if you listen closely, the room will whisper your name until you can't resist answering back. Let's see if we can coax a ghost into an interview tonight." He laughed lightly, but the laugh died in his throat when the radio clicked louder. The dial spun on its own, landing on a frequency filled with a harsh, rasping whisper. And then, his own name came through. Daniel. The first time he thought it was coincidence. The second time, denial. The third time, when the voice dragged his name out like a long exhale, his bravado cracked. He leaned closer, staring at the radio, waiting for static to carry his imagination. But what came instead was a knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from the inside of the wall behind his bed. He froze. The recorder captured every second, every breath. He forced a grin into the microphone, whispering to his audience, "Guess I'm not alone after all." His listeners thought it was part of the act. But for Daniel, it was the first step into a broadcast that would never end. When the receptionist slid the tarnished brass key across the counter, Daniel felt an unexpected chill travel down his spine. The key was heavy, too heavy for such a small object, and etched into the metal was the faint number, 616. The receptionist, a pale woman with hollow eyes that never quite met his, muttered something under her breath, as though rehearsing a line she had said many times before. "Top floor, end of the hall. Elevator slow, but it'll take you there." She avoided eye contact, her fingers trembling as they pulled back from the key like it was cursed. Daniel tried to laugh it off, but the weight of her unease pressed into him. He had stayed in countless hotels over the years as a traveling late-night radio host, but something about this moment, this silence that lingered just a little too long, made him second-guess why he had ever accepted the challenge from his listeners to spend the night in room 616. The elevator ride felt like a descent rather than an ascent. Each groan of the cables sounded like something trying to crawl its way up after him. By the time the doors opened onto the 6th floor, Daniel was already gripping his recording equipment tighter. The hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with faded floral wallpaper that peeled in strips, like old skin. The dim yellow bulbs above flickered unevenly, their glow revealing water stains on the ceiling and scratches along the walls, as if someone had dragged their fingernails in desperation. The carpeting was so worn that it looked scorched, and the air was thick with a metallic tang, like rust or blood. Daniel whispered into his recorder, "Listeners, I've just stepped onto the 6th floor, and I swear, it feels colder here than anywhere else in the hotel." Room 616 waited at the farthest end, its door darker than the others, as though the wood had been charred. A broken peephole hung loosely from the door, and the numbers were unevenly nailed in place, with the 1 almost falling off. He inserted the key, but the lock resisted, grinding like teeth against stone, before finally surrendering with a groan. When he stepped inside, the smell hit him first, musty, damp, and sharp with mildew. The room itself was a time capsule untouched for decades. Velvet curtains drooping with dust, a bedspread faded into gray, and an old rotary phone resting silently on the nightstand. Yet what unsettled Daniel the most was the silence. No hum of electricity, no muffled sounds from neighboring rooms, just a silence so absolute it felt like something was holding its breath. Setting up his microphone, he began speaking for his listeners, narrating the strangeness of the room. Room 616 is colder than anywhere else I've been tonight, he said, his voice steady though his hands trembled. It feels drained, as if life itself doesn't belong here. I don't know how to explain it, but even my footsteps seem quieter, like the floor is swallowing the sound. He placed his headphones on and began monitoring the room through his recorder. At first, there was nothing but static, harmless white noise. But then, faintly, so faintly he thought it might have been his imagination, came the sound of a whisper. Not a voice speaking words, but something like a hiss pressed against the walls. He froze. He rewound the tape, played it back again, and there it was, low, guttural, and insistent, just beneath the noise. Daniel spoke into the mic again, trying to steady his voice for the audience. Listeners, there's something here. I swear I just caught a whisper, but it didn't sound human. More like the building itself is speaking. He laughed nervously, but it died quickly in his throat. The room seemed to tighten around him, the shadows stretching just a little too far into the corners. The old phone rattled once, though no one touched it, and the curtains shivered though the windows were sealed shut. The silence pressed in again, suffocating. Daniel leaned back in the chair, trying to convince himself that it was just nerves. But deep down, he knew the first sign of room 616's reputation was already making itself known. He turned off the recorder for a moment, staring at the peeling wallpaper, wondering how many guests before him had sat in this same chair, heard the same whispers, and never walked out again. His throat felt dry, his pulse heavy in his ears. He whispered aloud, not into the microphone this time, but to himself. What did I just step into? For the first time in his career, Daniel wasn't sure if this broadcast would have an ending, or if he had just begun his final show. The clock struck midnight, and with trembling fingers, David flicked on his portable transmitter inside room 616. A red light blinked faintly on his console, signaling that his voice was about to spill into the quiet homes of late-night listeners across the city. "Good evening, night owls," he began, forcing a smile into his tone. "You're tuned into the midnight frequency, and tonight, I'm broadcasting live from the infamous room 616 of the abandoned Cliffside Hotel." His words cracked slightly, but he pressed on. He knew his audience loved when he leaned into the drama, but he couldn't shake the pressure in the air, as though the walls themselves were listening to him more intently than his audience. Almost instantly, his phone line buzzed with a caller. The distorted voice on the other end whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Before the line cut to static, David sat frozen. He hadn't even given out the call in number yet. His rational mind tried to dismiss it as a prank, maybe even a clever fan who had hacked into his frequency. But the unease was undeniable. His listeners flooded the chat room attached to the stream, urging him to keep going, to dig deeper. Encouraged, David walked over to the walls and pressed his ear against the peeling wallpaper. That's when he heard it, the faintest sound like a woman softly humming. Not in the hallway, not outside, but directly inside the wall. His breath hitched, but he reported it live, describing every detail to keep the audience hooked. "Listeners," he said in a hushed tone, "there's something in these walls, a lullaby, gentle, almost sad." As he spoke, the humming grew clearer, curling around his words like a second, ghostly broadcast. Suddenly, his equipment spiked, the levels rising though he hadn't touched a thing. A voice, faint and fragmented, slipped into the frequency. "Stay. Stay with us." His listeners erupted in the chat. "We hear it too. Someone's there. Don't stop recording." David's pulse raced. This was the breakthrough he had been chasing, an actual paranormal event unfolding live. But beneath his excitement, dread crept in. For the first time, he wondered if the legend was true, that every guest who heard the whispers of room 616 never truly left. Still, the performer in him pushed forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "you are now part of history. We're capturing the lost voices of room 616. He raised his mic toward the wall, amplifying the whispers for everyone to hear. The sound was fragile, mournful, but undeniable. A symphony of forgotten voices seemed to seep out of the plaster. Some wept, some whispered names, some laughed hollowly, as if mocking the living. The hairs on David's arms stood on end. He had always believed ghosts were metaphors, stories built to explain tragedy. But this was raw, unfiltered terror slipping through the static. The longer he listened, the more the voices tangled together, almost forming words directed specifically at him. "Broadcast forever. Join the static." His vision blurred at the edges, as though the very act of listening too closely was pulling him under. Yet, even then, he couldn't stop. The story was unfolding in real time, and he was the only one brave or foolish enough to deliver it. By the end of the first night, his equipment was hot to the touch, as though it had absorbed the anguish bleeding through the airwaves. His audience had doubled, then tripled. People across the city, and even from faraway countries, were tuning in, unable to look away from the ghostly broadcast. David signed off with his usual line, "Stay awake, stay aware." But the words felt hollow, almost mocked by the lingering whispers that clung to the static long after he ended the show. Alone in room 616, the walls hummed with restless energy, as though they were waiting for the next night. And deep down, David knew he had already gone too far to turn back. Nate had always prided himself on not being easily rattled. After years of covering everything from grisly crime stories to ghost hunts staged for cheap thrills, he had built a kind of emotional armor.